Hey, welcome back, everybody. Good to see you all. Well, we're ready to get started with Chapter 8 from The Treasure from the Haunted Pagoda, that book by Eric B. Hare that took place over 100 years ago. Let's see if I can get into the camera here. There we go. Where Elder and Mrs. Hare and their family had served as missionaries to the country that was called Burma back then. Now it's called Myanmar. They had been there. Do you remember what they were digging for? Treasure, yes, but not the silver bricks, not the diamonds. They were looking for people who don't know Jesus. And along the way, as we've been hearing these stories, we've been learning some important things. And probably most importantly, is how to deal with scary things in scary times. Scary things, as we've been learning, often aren't really scary when we understand them. Things that sound as if they might be dangerous and things that are out to get us just turn out to be misunderstandings. But we've also learned that when there are truly scary things like evil angels or diseases, that we don't even need to be afraid of them, because we have to remember that our God is stronger than the most scary things that Satan can invent or that this sinful world can bring out. But as we move on into this next section of the Eric B. Hare story, we have to ask the question, okay, God can be stronger than evil angels and he can be stronger than disease, but what about things like airplanes, warplanes? Is he stronger than bombs falling on a city? Is he stronger than enemy soldiers shooting guns? Because you remember that as Eric B. Hare and his wife and two children returned back to Burma after having been on furlough for a few years, they returned back just a couple of months before World War II stretched out to involve the area of Burma and the Pacific Islands, because America was now entering into war against the Japanese. And as the Japanese began to invade Burma, the people in the capital city of Rangoon, where Eric and his family were now living, were becoming very nervous. They had seen planes fly overhead, and they were worried that any day now the Japanese might decide to send bombing planes to fly into the country and try to bomb the capital city of Rangoon. But as days went by and no planes came, everyone seemed to get over their fears a bit and decide it must be okay to go out and about and do what we need to do. And Eric decided to travel up the Salween River to visit Peter, who had been one of the teachers, one of the oldest teachers there at the Onda Mission School. And as he was sailing up the Salween River, he saw a whole flight of Japanese planes. You could tell they were Japanese by the red circles under their wings. And they flew by down the Salween River, heading right to Rangoon City, where Eric had left his wife and children. As the planes flew by, Eric immediately gave the order, turn this boat around, we have to get back. My wife and kids are back there in Rangoon where the bombers are headed. But it took hours to make their way back down the river and then make their way across on the roads to Rangoon. And you could see as you came in closer and closer to the city of Rangoon, smoke rising from buildings that had been hit by bombs, some buildings looking destroyed or at least damaged. Thankfully, the part of the city where Eric's wife and kids had been staying was okay. They had heard the air raid sirens and they had run down to hide in a cement ditch behind the house. And they had stayed there as Japanese bombers had flown over the city, and as responding fighter planes called P-40 Flying Tigers had taken off from the airports of the city to go and attack the Japanese bombers and drive them off, resulting in some amazing airplane dogfights, as they were called, with planes flying back and forth, zipping and twisting, trying to destroy each other. Eric's wife and kids had obeyed orders. When the sirens are going off and there's planes in the air, you hide in those ditches, you hide in those cement gutters, and you don't come out so you don't get hurt. But many other people had not obeyed. Many other people had been too curious. When they'd seen planes flying, heard bombs going off, seen lights flashing up in the sky, they had climbed out of the gutters and gone out to watch and see what was happening. And because of that, as planes had dropped bombs or as other planes had crashed and fallen down to the earth, over 1,300 people had died and many, many more were wounded. This was an important lesson for the people of the time of the city, and it's an important lesson for us today too, that when experts are giving warnings, make sure you follow those warnings when emergencies are happening. But why was the city of Rangoon being attacked anyhow? What was so important about it? Well, it was the capital city of Burma, and more importantly, it had lots of factories where they could make lots of things like trucks and jeeps and ammunition, which were being then sent to the ally of Burma, the army of China, because they were fighting against the Japanese. And since Rangoon had a road which led all the way for hundreds of miles up through the jungles and through the mountains, all the way to China, the Japanese knew it was very important to try to stop the Burmese people from supporting the Chinese army. And so they continued their bombing attacks on Rangoon, and bombings began to be almost a daily event. The next bombing that took place in Rangoon happened on Christmas Day, and everybody had to go down and take their Christmas dinner and eat it in the ditch while they stayed there for a few hours waiting for the bombings to be over, trying to stay safe. And as these bombings became more and more frequent, the missionaries began to think, we need to get our families out. We need to get out the missionary women and kids. There's some other American families here as well who are coming to our church. We need to get them out of here. The best way to get them out is to send them out to the country of India, because that's a big nation. It's very safe. It's far enough away from Japan that it's not under attack. But how will we get them there? There are roads to India, but they're long. They require crossing many rivers and going for days through mountains. It would be hard to pack enough supplies to travel, and the cars wouldn't hold up very well. How could they do that? No, that wouldn't work. What about planes? Well, there were no planes in Burma now that could be used for transporting passengers. All the planes that were left were the fighter planes. But boats, that was the idea. And so Eric and some of the other missionaries went down to the docks to be able to see if they could if they could buy tickets and arrange passage for these women and children to get on boats to go to India. But when they arrived, they talked to the agents at the ticket agents at the dock, and they found out that there were already over 3,000 people waiting on a list just to be able to get on a boat. Oh my goodness. The agent said, "Go ahead, I'll put your names on the list too. What's a few more names? But I can't tell you when it will be that you can find space on a boat to get out. There's many, many people already ahead of you." And for the next month, while bombings happened every day, Eric and his family and the other missionaries' families just waited. They prayed and they trusted God. A month of every day having to run out into the gutters whenever the siren would go off, whether it was during the day or at night, spending hours listening to bombs falling, and then coming back inside their house if their houses were still standing. Some people's houses were knocked down. But finally, on January 20th, a phone call came. Eric answered it, and it was the agent down at the wharf at the dock. And he said, "Okay, if you can get your family down here in 1.5 hours, we've got a boat that has space for a few people. I can put some people on board." 1.5 hours. They had to pack hurriedly, but Mrs. Hare and the 2 kids were able to get safely on board that boat. And Eric said goodbye. They prayed, and then they waved to each other as the boat pulled out of the bay, or out of the dock of Rangoon into the Bay of Bengal to be able to sail off to India, which would take them a few days. Well, 2 days after the boat had sailed away, Eric received a message, or rather heard some news. 2 different boats that were on their way to India from Burma had been hit and sunk. Was it by airplanes? Was it by submarines? They didn't even know. How could it have happened? They didn't know which boats they were. Eric felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Oh, what if his wife and children had been on one of those boats and been sunk and drowned? And it was hard to hold on to his faith, to trust that God would make it okay. It was even harder when some of the people around Eric's home and the part of the city where he lived, who didn't care for Christians, started taunting him, saying, "Oh, how does it feel, huh? I bet your wife and kids were sunk with those boats." It's a very cruel thing to say. But Eric just had to reply, "I don't know that for certain. So we're just going to believe that God has taken them safely across." And do you know, about a week after the boats had sailed, a letter arrived for Eric, and it was written on the cover, on the envelope, with a handwriting that he recognized very well, for it was his wife's handwriting. And it was postmarked from India. And the letter said, "We've arrived safely, and it was a miracle that God is here. Just after our boat sailed out from Rangoon into the Bay of Bengal, the part of the Indian Ocean that separates Burma and India, a thick fog settled over us, and we were worried at first. We thought perhaps it would cause the ship to get lost, or maybe we would crash into rocks. Maybe we wouldn't be able to find our way and have to turn around and go back. That fog stayed over us for 4 days. We couldn't even see the sunlight through that fog, not until we were able to reach Calcutta. Just as we arrived at Calcutta, the fog cleared up and went away. Then when we reached the actual city and got off the boat, we saw in newspapers that 2 other boats that had been sailing from Burma to India had been sunk. They'd been hit by airplanes that had spotted them, but nobody had been able to spot us, for we were covered by the fog cloud. We were covered by God's cloud." And that was another lesson that God was stronger than airplanes, than anything evil that could possibly come and attack. God had power over nature and he had power over the enemy. Well, in the meantime, Eric and the other missionary men now who had stayed behind were working with volunteer ambulances. They would go out and spend shifts working, going through the city after bombing runs, taking care of people who had been wounded, rescuing people out of their collapsed houses. Eric wanted to be able to reach out and contact Peter, the teacher at the Onda mission station, but there was no way of communicating there now. There were no telephones that were functioning, no telegraphs functioning. There was no way to travel there. And Eric knew that the Onda mission station was directly in the path that the enemy would take because they had heard now that Japan had sent armies marching down from Siam, the mountains, remember, where On Bunt had gone to be able to tell people about Jesus. And they were marching through the Siamese mountains into Burma. Meanwhile, the bombings were taking place day and night. There were some nights where Eric would spend the entire night sitting in a cement ditch, waiting for the bombings to stop. All that time, afraid, wondering what was going to happen, and on top of that, scratching. Why was he scratching? Because there were mosquitoes everywhere. In a jungle country like Burma, there's lots of mosquitoes, and if you want to be able to sleep without getting bitten all the time, you sleep under mosquito nets. But when you have to leave your home and go running and hide in the gutter all night long, you can't take your mosquito nets with you. So mosquitoes would bite, and poor Eric would scratch and scratch. As the bombs boomed around him, as the mosquitoes buzzed in his ears, as the nights wore on, do you wonder how Eric was able to remain sane, how he was able to remain unafraid and continue trusting God? Well, do you know, Eric tells a story of how he learned how to trust during those long, difficult nights. He learned from a kid. Let's hear how. Well, the first Sabbath after the bombings had begun, there were 8 bombings over that Friday night. And Eric and everyone who was hiding in the gutters was just exhausted. Come Saturday morning, it was Sabbath. They knew that they were supposed to go and attend the Sabbath school that they would always attend. But would there be any Sabbath school anyhow? Would anyone else even bother showing up after having spent all night in the gutter? Or when they went and got to the church they would normally have their Sabbath school in, 37 other people showed up. And as those families all gathered together, they began singing. And they sang a hymn, which was so special and meant so much to them. It's a special hymn at all times, and you can imagine how important it was to them during this terrible time of nightly bombings and constant fear. The hymn was a shelter in the time of storm. And they all sang together, raising their voices. The Lord's our rock, in him we hide, a shelter in the time of storm. Secure whatever may betide, a shelter in the time of storm. And after they finished singing the first verse, a young boy stood up. His name was Stanley, and he was 12 years old. And he and his father both stood up. And they said, we have a testimony we want to give. We want to say something. And then Stanley told the story. His father had gone off to work, and Stanley was at home alone with his 2 sisters who were 8 and 9. And they had been given instructions, if the siren starts, you go and you climb into that big cement gutter behind our house. And you stay there until the siren stops, until the bombing stops. Well, wouldn't you know it? After dark, the bombers flew in over Rangoon, and the siren went off, and Stan grabbed his 2 sisters and ran down into the storm drain. And the storm drain was secure. It was a good shelter, but it was dark, and it was smelly, and it had cobwebs. And you know what makes cobwebs? Spiders. It had spiders, and there were rats scuttling about. And it was just not a pleasant place to be. And Stanley's 2 sisters were crying and crying, and Stanley was trying to stay brave. And as the bombs were falling, suddenly Stanley thought of something. The Holy Spirit put it in his mind, and he said to his sisters, hey, you know what we should do? Let's sing. You know, when we make noise inside this big cement tube, this gutter, it makes our voices echo. And I bet you if we sing loud enough, we won't be able to hear the bombs. And they began to sing. And the song they sang was an easy one. I'm sure you all know it. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And they sang loud, they sang strong as bombs continued to fall around them. Little ones to him belong. They are weak, but he is strong. And they continued singing until the alarms finished. And then Dad came back after work and found them safe. And he had asked Stanley, Stanley, weren't you scared? Weren't you scared during that time out there inside the gutter? Oh, no, I wasn't scared, said Stanley. And this is what he also told the people in the church that Sabbath day. Because when bombs burst, you just sing. When bombs burst, you just sing. And you know, everyone in that Sabbath school class, including Eric Hare, learned an important lesson from Stanley's witness, and they sang even louder as they continued singing their hymn. A shade by day, defense by night, a shelter in the time of storm. No fears alarm, no foes affright, a shelter in the time of storm. And after that verse, Mr. Martin and his wife stood up, and they gave a testimony. You see, we were just arriving home, said Mr. Martin, and suddenly a siren went off. I barely had time to park my car, and we jumped out from the car and ran into the trench behind our home. And just as we got into our trench, a bomb landed right smack on our house. The whole house blew up, and the car caught on fire. Everything that we owned was destroyed. But do you know, after the bombing was done and we climbed out from the gutter, we weren't injured. We still were alive. We hadn't been harmed. And we looked at each other and said, God protected us. And everyone in the Sabbath school sang with even more faith and joy. The raging storms around us beat, a shelter in the time of storm. We find in him a safe retreat, a shelter in the time of storm. And then, wouldn't you know, another man stood up to give a testimony, and his name was Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross was an American who had become a Seventh-day Adventist and baptized just the very first day that the air raids began in Rangoon. And he worked as an electrician, trying to keep the telegraph poles all up and running, trying to keep the electrical wires connected to the important buildings in the city as the bombings were going on day after day. And one day that previous week, he had been up a phone pole when an air raid began. It was easy enough for his 5 assistants on the ground to all run and jump into a ditch, but Mr. Ross was way up, 20 feet up on a telephone pole, and he had to make his way down as bombs began to land, and bombs were coming closer and closer. As he ran and jumped into the ditch and pulled one of his assistants down with him, a bomb landed nearby and struck with such force that 4 of the men in the very ditch with Mr. Ross had been killed instantly. Cars all around had been flattened. Houses had caught on fire and collapsed. But Mr. Ross didn't even get a scratch. And he looked at everyone and said, God was my shelter in the time of storm. And they all joyously finished singing the hymn together. Mighty rock in a weary land, cooling shade on the burning sand, faithful guide for the pilgrim band, a shelter in the time of storm. And that was the shelter that Eric had to hang on to. And that's a shelter we all need to hang on to. We need to take our peace knowing that God is our shelter during any difficult time, whether it's bombs and enemies invading, or if it's scary times like a bad disease going around that people need to try to stay away from. Well, the Japanese continued marching across the country, and the people in Rangoon City wondered what their next move was going to be. Would their small Burmese forces be able to hold off the Japanese as they were marching across the country? When the Japanese reached the one shore of the Salween River, the river was wide enough that they couldn't make it across easily. And actually, the Burmese forces were able to hold them there for about 2 weeks. And while they were being held and the people in Rangoon City were wondering what to do, they kept asking each other, when should we evacuate? What'll be the signal? How do we know when we should leave? What if we leave and then the Japanese army doesn't come? What if we abandon all of our things here and then it turns out we didn't need to? Let's wait a little longer. Let's wait a little longer. And they kept waiting to see what was going to happen. And then one day the messages started to come. The Japanese army has made it across the Salween River. They've made it past the Burmese forces. They could be here any day. And finally, on February 18, Mr. Hare found out that the volunteer ambulance service was being shut down. And as he began walking home from where he had gone to report for the ambulance service that day, he saw that there were no newspaper boys on the corners. That's unusual. Usually there was always a newspaper boy trying to sell a newspaper. And then when he got home, he talked to the other missionary men that were living there with him now, after all the families had been able to escape, all the wives and children had been able to escape. And they started talking, saying, well, maybe we need to try calling over to the American consulate. We'll ask them if it's time for us to leave. They picked up the phone, but there was no signal. The phones weren't working now either. Oh, that's strange. They said, well, let's go over to the American consulate and we'll talk to them because they're kind of like the representatives for our government here in Burma. And so we'll get their advice. And when they got to the American consulate, the doors were closed and locked, and there was a sign saying, "We have evacuated to the city of Myanmar." Said Eric, I think it's probably time for us to go. Yes, said some of the others, we need to go. And one of them, Mr. Christensen, said, I want to be able to leave as soon as possible, but do you know, there's still 2 American families that I've been trying to help get on a boat. I really want to help them be able to get out. We've got plans for them to sail on a boat this afternoon. We'll get them on a boat, and then the following day we can leave. We'll pack up the one car that we have, and you, Eric, and myself, and also Mr. Moline, the 3 of us will be able to pack our few belongings inside a car, and we'll start driving towards India. That was the plan. And so all of them went over to help the American families get down to the dock. And when they got there, the dock was crowded. There was already hundreds of people trying to get on that boat. No room on the boat for these families. They couldn't make their way through. And as the boat sailed off, over 200 people were left standing behind on the dock that wanted to get on. But there was another boat coming in the next day. It was supposed to arrive at 8:30 in the morning, and then it would sail at 4 o'clock that evening. Mr. Christensen and Mr. Hare thought about it, and they said, you know what we need to do? We need to get here really early. We'll get here before that boat even arrives in the morning. We'll bring the families here. We'll be ready to go. And then that way they can get on board first thing while they're still unloading from arriving. So that's what they did the next day. They got those families down to the dock early in the morning. As soon as the boat arrived, the gangplanks were down, and they found a little space to start getting onto the boat. They got them on, and they got those families safely secured in place. The families had their own rooms to stay in even. They had all their belongings packed up, and Mr. Hare, Mr. Moline, Mr. Christensen, they went back down to stand on the dock to be able to wave and say goodbye to them. And they stood around waiting for the boat to sail off, and it got to be 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were supposed to set sail, and the boat hadn't taken off yet, and it seemed like things were still just running kind of behind. Everything was all set though, and they just were waiting for this boat to go so they could go and pack their car and drive to India. When suddenly an announcement came over the bullhorns of the dock area. All boats have been canceled. No more boats sailing out from Rangoon. The military is taking command of the boats. Everyone must get off the boats. What were they going to do? These 2 families had young children. They needed to get on the boats to India. Mr. Christensen, Mr. Moline, and Mr. Hare only had one car between the 3 of them. It would just barely hold them and their belongings to drive to India. And there's no way that these families with young children could drive all the way to India as well. That would take days. It would be dangerous and hot. It would be thirsty. It would be a very difficult time. And as everyone streamed back off the boats, women and children and men, all looking worried, some people crying, some other people even angry and fighting, saying, I don't want to get off the boat. Mr. Hare and Mr. Christensen looked at each other, and they realized they might be stuck in Rangoon City a lot longer than they had planned. Well, we're going to find out next Sabbath what they're able to figure out in order to get those families out and be able to make their own evacuation from Rangoon City all the way to India. So tune in again next Sabbath as we continue hearing these stories of Eric B. Hare. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to telling more stories to you soon. Bye, and God bless.